welcome everyone. I'm Matthew Evangelista, the interim director of the program, and it's my great pleasure to welcome to Cornell Carla Martinez Machain, who is going to be introduced by Avishai Melamed, who's going to carry on things from there. So welcome and thank you, Avi.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's meeting of the Refugees and Conflicts seminar series. Our guest speaker is Carla Martinez Machain, a professor of political science at the State University of New York at Buffalo. Her research, funded by the Department of Defense's Minerva Initiative and the Army Research Office, among others, focuses on foreign policy analysis with a focus on military policy and international conflict. Dr. Machain's research has been published in the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Politics, Journal of Conflict Resolution, International Studies Quarterly, and others. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Avi, and thank you, everyone. It's I was just mentioning, it's my first year in the state of New York, so I'm really enjoying getting to see a little bit more of it, and hopefully this spring weather sticks around a bit more now. Anyway, what I'm presenting today, and I know some of you already did a little bit of reading, it's actually this co-authored book, Beyond the Wire, that I wrote with the Michaels, not that Michael Flynn. I always feel like I have to say that. It's a different Michael Flynn and Andrew Stravers. And what I'm going to try to do in the next 30 to 40 minutes is give you a tour through the book. I'm going to be very ambitious. We'll see how much I actually get through. So I'll spend most of the time in the first 3 chapters of the book, where we establish the theory and the base findings from which we then take off towards the other. But I'm also going to try to give you a little bit of a preview of the rest of the chapters, and I'm happy to go into a bit more depth on those during the Q&A as well. So I should also add that, of course, this is already a published work, but this is definitely a research agenda that I and my co-authors are looking to continue. So any comments that you have, any tearing apart of it that you want to do is still helpful at this stage, right? I'll talk a little bit more at the end about where it's going next, but there's a lot more. There's a lot that I have learned from working on this project. And again, even though it's published, there's still a lot of room for you to make suggestions, have ideas, us to have a fun conversation about it. So just very quickly to start, that should be moving, but it's not. It should be a cute little GIF that is moving, but it's not. So just ignore that. That's what it should be showing is changing levels of US military deployments in the last 70 years. And if you could see it, you would see that while there is variation across the different regions that the US deploys to across years, the one constant we see is that the US has a large military presence throughout the world in the last 70 years, right? So the regional focus might change, but on average, every year since 1950, about 25% of the US military is deployed abroad in a given year. In 2020, about 175 countries had some type of US military presence in their country. Some of those, as you know, are very small, right? A small training deployment, someone attached to an embassy, things like that. But some of them are much larger, have a much bigger impact on their host country communities. And so really the big motivating question that started this project is, what is it that makes people in these countries be willing to have a foreign military presence in their country, right? Because while we know that some of them are there as part of an invasion force, you don't get a say in those cases, right? But in some cases, they're there consensually, right? And I think, for me growing up in Mexico, my co-authors in the US, it seemed very alien, very strange, right? That you would have a foreign military right down the street, right? And so what is it that makes some people accept that, others reject it, right? And in a way, the way we see this, and we talk about this in the book, is we really see it as the one of the micro foundations of the US-led international order, right? The US has somehow gotten all of these people, at least to some degree, on board with having this military presence. And so what makes that happen, right? So to tell you a little bit now about the methods that guide most of the analysis in the book, there's two basic prongs to it. So the first one is we did fieldwork in 6 different countries. As you can see, there's a little bit of a gap here. We all know what happened in 2020. So unfortunately, our travel to Asia that was supposed to happen in 2020 got interrupted by the pandemic. Even 2021, we didn't see it as, worth the risk to communities to insert ourselves in there. So we did this remotely, less than ideal, but we were able to talk to just about as many people as we did in the other places. So we picked 6 countries, different regions, all of them either with a large US military presence, or in the Latin American cases, ones that had a large military presence in the past, Panama, right? Or Peru, one with a more limited presence, but that was very much focused on military cooperation. We also wanted to go to Latin America during fieldwork because during our broader surveys, we did not have any Latin American countries that had a big enough population of US service members where we felt like we could get enough of the population who had interacted with them. So deployments to Latin America are very limited, so we didn't do the large surveys, and that's why we did fieldwork. So besides the fieldwork where we interviewed mostly elites, so we did government officials in the host country, we did US, DOD and State Department personnel, journalists, activists, anti-basing activists, civil society leaders. We interviewed them in these countries. We also had 3 years of surveys, 2018 through 2020. So that one we were able to do in 2020. And so we picked 14 countries that had a sizable US military presence. We tried to get a little bit of variation by region. Of course, you can see we didn't get to Latin America or Africa. We can talk more about that in the Q&A. We had 1,000 respondents per country per year across 3 years. That gave us 42,000 respondents. Just to be clear, they weren't the same across years. So every year we would get a new sample, right? So that's the method that most of the work is based on. There's a few other data sets we use. I'll talk more about that later. So here's the big research question, right? How do I should say non-invasion really, because it's not just non-combat, it's non-invasion military deployments affect how it is that individuals in the host country view the United States. And so going into it, we basically had 2 different potential narratives, right? The one on the bottom, which is the one that I think is most familiar to most of us, right? The idea of the protesters who don't like the US military being in their country. That's from a protest at Ramstein, right, in Germany. And the idea is the US military is in our country, we don't like it. It's either harming our communities directly or it's representing imperialism. US military there leads to more negative perceptions of the US, right? The alternate narrative, and that's the one that we have up top, is the idea that in some of these cases, what the US military is doing is engaging in outreach, right? So, for example, in Peru and in some other Latin American countries, they do things like they have a campaign where the US military shows up and they vaccinate children and cows, and they might build a school, build a well, and the locals love it. They see it as a direct benefit to them, right? And so they get to see the human side of the US military, and then they update to view the US military more positively than they otherwise would, right? And so we want to really explore both of these dynamics, right? What leads to the positive perceptions, the negative ones. And so in terms of the theory that we're using to explain this, or at least to generate our initial set of hypotheses, we're drawing from political psychology, largely, right? Specifically from contact theory, right? And so this idea that when you have contact with an outgroup, with someone who you perceive as being part of an outgroup, that makes you drop more of your biases against them, view them more as a human like you, and have more positive perceptions at them, right? And so we know that when the US military deploys to foreign countries, with, of course, a lot of variation in how much of this actually happens, but oftentimes they're interacting with host state residents, right? In some cases, they are formal efforts, right? They're intentionally doing it to promote goodwill. So the vaccinating children and cows is a formal goodwill effort. Sending out your military to teach English at a local school, things like that, it's formal, right? They know what they're doing. But in other cases, we also know that there's routine contact that happens, right? When you put a big population of service members in a country, they're people who are going to go about their daily lives and they're going to have routine contact, right? Contact. They might become friends with people, be their neighbors, their kids might have the same after-school activities. They might come shopping in your shop, eat at your restaurant, routine socializing, right? And so both of these are happening, and we have some expectation that there will be some effect where that contact could lead to more positive perceptions. Of course, you're also thinking there's also the money, right? Maybe it's not so much the contact, it's the money I'm getting from the Americans, right? We all know that the US military comes with these huge financial flows, right? Maintaining a US military presence abroad, even in the countries where you have a smaller presence, not quite the Japans or Germany, big influx of money coming in, right? And some of it, again, it's formal exchanges, right? So for example, in one of the interviews that we did in Lakenheath, England, they told us explicitly, this American NCO told us, whenever we do have to have contractors do something for us, we pick them locally, not even just from England, but from the town around us, right? And it's a way to basically inject money into the local economy and give them this kind of positive externality, right? The thing about economic benefits is that they happen at different socioeconomic levels, right? So it might be at the very top, someone who owns a construction firm gets hired to build a new barracks, right, at the military base, but it can also be someone who has a food truck, right? The Americans stop by on their way out from work and patronize your business, right? So we do want to also explore this, whether maybe some of these positive perceptions are happening because you're getting money from the American military presence, right? And so our starting off point is basically saying that either that you personally having contact or an economic benefit, we should expect that to correlate with more positive views, and that the same thing should happen if someone in your social network, a close friend or relative also has had contact or an economic benefit. That's our initial expectation we go into this with. So let me show you just some very basic initial data, right? So here we have the views of the different US actors. We asked respondents about the US military, the US troops, government, and people. So the more yellowish colors are more favorable, that purple, less favorable, black is don't know, decline to answer, right? So just from glancing at this, it looks like what we would expect, right? So in general, people like the US government, the least. I should note we're doing these surveys during the Trump administration. So when we were doing fieldwork, we heard all sorts of things about Trump, and they were saying, you're a wonderful president, but they did not like the government. We can talk more about the Trump effect as well during the Q&A if you guys want to. They did not like the US government very much. US people, the US population, they felt pretty positively about the US military, somewhere in between. Of course, there's variation across countries, right? The Poles feel pretty positively about the US, Turkey less so, but those patterns kind of hold across. When it comes to interaction with the US military, again, we picked countries where there was a large US military population to kind of increase the chances that they had interacted with them. On average, it was about 10% of our respondents had some contact. I will go ahead and note right now that Kuwait is really weird. And we dealt with this in a few different ways, both in terms of the stats and in terms of, asking some experts about this. Some of it was we just dropped this from a lot of our analyses, but we should talk more about that during the Q&A. But anyway, about 10% of our respondents had contact with the US military. And so when we put these two together, right, what does that look like? So what you see here, I know is a lot. I will walk you through some of it. So we have the modal response towards each one of our groups, the troops, the government, the people divided by whether you had contact or not, right? So on the left columns, we have no contact, the right columns, yes, contact, and then what was your modal response in the surveys? Same thing, the yellow is very favorable, purple, less favorable, right? So again, lots going on here. So I'll draw your attention to the upper left-hand little block up there, right? So it's your views of the US military, and then have you had personal contact yourself, yes or no, right? So the first thing that jumps out up there, right? Those who have had contact seem to have more favorable views of the US military that don't, and that seems to be true across most countries in our sample, right? A few exceptions, but in general, those with contact seem to have most positive views. Right now, you're probably thinking, but all the other variables, right? All of these other things, you're just showing this relation between two things. There's a lot of things that go into forming those opinions. So let's complicate it, right? So here are the results of our categorical multi-level regression analysis, where we did actually throw in all of the other factors. So the nice thing about the model we chose is that it allows us to have variables at the individual level for the respondents, right? So are you a man? Are you a woman? Are you non-binary? That was the reference category. Are you old, young, etc.? And it also allows us to include country level variables. So are you a democracy or not? Just in general, we also looked at coefficients, allowed the coefficients to vary by country as well, right? Are you a US? And then country level variables. So we included all that because we think that matters. The individual level stuff, as well as just in general, England might feel differently about the US military than Turkey does, right? So we took all that into account, and also the categorical model, what it allowed us to do is it allowed us to not force the responses into just one single linear trend, right? More positive, more negative. What it allowed us to do was to look at the relationship between contact or benefits or whatever we're looking at, and the positive responses and the negative responses, right? It allowed us to look at both of them separately. So here what we have is we have the neutral category as our reference point, right? And so the yellow dots are the don't know, decline to answer, right? The red are the more negative views. We combined the very negative and the somewhat negative, and the black dots are the positive views. So again, lots going on. Let's go to the upper left-hand corner, which I think is very illustrative. So again, we're looking at personal contact, right? No is a reference category. So we're comparing the yeses to the nos. And how do you feel about the US military, right? So the first thing we see, right, is that people who have had personal contact with the US military are less likely to say, don't know, so left of the 0 line, right? Less likely to say, don't know, decline to answer. So they're less likely to have that no response, right? Second, we see that the positive, right, the probability of responding positively about the US military actually is much larger, right? You see an increase for those people who have had personal contact. So that's the good news, right? People who have had personal contact, they're more likely, it's a big effect to say good things about the US military. The bad news, at least from the US military point of view, not so much the activists, is that negative dot, the red dot, right, that's also significant. So basically what we seem to be finding, right, is that contact with the US military is pushing people away from like the don't know, decline to answer, and the neutrals, and it's making them have either more positive or more negative opinions, right? And so there seems to be this strengthening, right, of your perceptions of US actors. There's both a negative and positive effect. The positive effect is indeed larger, right? But there's something going on, right? The positive and the negative. So the positive, I think, these ideas that we have about economic benefits, about contact, that fits with those expectations, right? That makes sense. But what we want to explore, or what we explored a lot in the book, is also those negative interactions, because there seems to be a big chunk of people who do have personal contact with the US military and also have negative views, right? So what is it that drives those negative interactions, those negative views, and what are some things to do about them? So we have 3 chapters in the book where we explore that, and I will not do them justice because I will zoom right through them, but that's what we have Q&A for. We can have fun with that. So one is focused on crime committed by US service members. The other one, we look specifically at protests against either the US or the US military. And then finally, we look at ethnic, religious, or racial minorities in the host countries and how their experiences with the US military might be different and possibly more negative than what the majority group's experiences. So to begin with crime, right? And again, this is something that we do tend to, even within the US, to hear about a lot in the media, when there are these high profile cases in which US service members commit a crime against someone in the host country. Some of you who might be old enough to remember this 1995 very famous, very unfortunate case of 3 US Marines raping a 12-year-old girl in Okinawa, right? And this incident really caused essentially an international problem, right? It threatened the alliance. So we actually were able to interview the former commander of US forces in Japan, who was the commander of US forces in Japan at the time. And he told us, I was worried about the future of our alliance, right? Because when this event happened, it really drove a lot of negative sentiment towards the US. And he said, justifiably so, right? And so there are these big cases, right, that we hear about in the news, but I think what we hear about less is a routine crime that people in these facing communities sometimes experience, right? So things like drunk driving and theft and drug-related crimes, sexual assault and rape that isn't always someone, a stranger, right, jumping out at you, that it can be someone within your social network. And this is happening, right, on an everyday basis for these people. And we really wanted to explore that. So the way we did it methodologically, and this is something we struggled a little bit with, right? There's basically 2 ways to get this crime data. One is to look at actual reported crime data. We know that US embassies keep track of it. The host countries in different ways keep track of it. Our concern with that is we were worried about underreporting and specifically systematic underreporting of crime. So we know from the criminologists that certain types of crime, again, sexual assault and rape are one example, are underreported, right? We also know that given the power dynamic between the US military and the host country, in many cases, we're going to have people afraid to report crimes. It probably is people in lower socioeconomic groups who are afraid of backlash against them, either from their own government, from the US military. So we worried about it. So what we ended up deciding to do is to just ask in our survey about people's experiences with crime, if they had been victimized, if they knew someone who had been victimized. Imperfect method, right? We know that people can lie in these surveys, but we chose that option, and as we saw it as a better one to use. And again, we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. So we had very simple hypotheses, right? The first 2 were basically, if you or someone you know are criminally victimized by a member of the US military, you will have more negative views. This will be one of the drivers of negative views. Something else that we wanted to explore, and this was something that was motivated by the stories we heard while doing field work, is whether this effect would actually be smaller in cases in which you had also had personal contact with the US military, meaning that people whose social network included service members, and again, we're drawing a little bit from political psychology here, would be less likely to attribute a crime to the US military as a whole and be more likely to attribute it to the individual who had done it. So we wanted to explore that as well. So what do we find? Again, it's a little clunky, but let me walk you through some of that. So up top, right? So people who have a personal experience with crime actually had a lower probability of expressing unfavorable attitudes towards the US. So this goes completely against our hypothesis one expectations, right? But this was something that surprised us. So if you were personally victimized, you were less likely to have negative views than someone who hadn't. Not so with network. If you knew someone who had been victimized, then people behaved in accordance with our hypothesis, with what we expected. You knew someone who was victimized, you're more likely to have an unfavorable attitude, right? The effect on favorable attitudes was less significant. So we focused on these two for now, right? We looked at the predicted probabilities as, so basically, if we're looking at hypothesis 3, right? That interaction with contact. This shows Germany, again, because we were allowing the coefficients to vary by country. Other countries look similar. So basically, what you'll see here, again, upper left-hand corner, my favorite place to be. If you look at people who haven't had contact, right? How likely are they to express positive views? The ones with no contact, whether they experience a crime or not, they have a similar probability of expressing positive views. The people with contact, the ones who have experienced crime, surprisingly enough, have a more positive view than the ones with no contact and crime, yes, crime. The reference category is contact, yes, crime, no, right? So this is surprising, right? I mean, that, well, first of all, that there's no difference here, but also that here, right, these people experiencing crime still more likely to have positive views. And so what we think is going on is not so much that crime makes you have positive, and you're right, that in some cases, if there's a follow-up, you might be a little bit more content. Again, criminology tells us that seeing that there's something done about your crime lets you walk away with more positive views. But beyond that, we're not saying crime is causing these positive views, but I think what we're catching here is some of this embeddedness of the US military within communities. I think I was talking to Emily earlier about this one case that we heard about while we were doing fieldwork. Terrible, very tragic, where a woman in Japan had been killed by her former partner, who was a US service member. And what's interesting is she had actually reported him for abuse, have gotten restraining order against him, right? So she had previously experienced the crime from a US service member even before she was killed. At the time she was killed, she was in a relationship with a different person who was also a service member, right? So this was someone clearly who moved in this social circle and had very different experiences. So even though she had experienced the crime carried out by a service member, she was willing to have a relationship with someone else who was a service member, right? And so I think that this is what this is picking up on, right? These communities have become linked in many ways, and oftentimes the crime you're experiencing isn't coming from a stranger jumping out of the bushes. It's coming from someone, your romantic partner, someone, a relative's friend, things like that, someone who you encounter at a party, things like that, right? And so what we get from this is that, the US military's reaction to when there is a crime committed by a service member can be to shut down and isolate, right, from communities. And we actually think that that's not necessarily the most effective way to address the way the crime is actually happening, right? Because first of all, under isolation, you're still imposing costs on the community, right? You're still polluting the community. There's still noise. There's still the imperialism. They're still getting costs, but they're losing some of the positive contact and the economic flows. We heard this during fieldwork. It makes people suspicious, right? When the US is shut down, they're saying, it can range from the very innocuous. In Germany, their suspicion was that the Americans were not recycling. And so they had to bring them on to show them that they were indeed recycling. In Latin America, where they were saying they're getting ready to build a secret base in the Amazon to invade Venezuela, right? So from the nefarious to the, I guess the not recycling would be pretty bad, but right, it leads to this increased sense of suspicion. And so rather than isolation, we think what makes more sense really is monitoring, integration, talking to communities, engaging with communities. I think again, it was Emily who I was talking to about this, doing the sort of things that you would do with college students, right? Talking about positive consent and actual real gender education, things like that, right? Doing things like providing rides to service members so that they're not driving drunk. All of these things that actually address the types of crimes that are happening, as opposed to, we're gonna shut down for a week as punishment for this crime that happened, and then not really address the root cause. That's something. What am I doing at time? Like 10-ish more minutes? Yeah. So go for a little bit. Protest, right? So bad thing happened, protest also happens, right? So we really wanted to look at what is it that is causing US, anti-US and anti-basing protests, both at the macro level, right? When are there more protests? And then also at the micro level. So trying to forecast a little bit of what is it that makes me an individual actually go out and, engage in a protest, which can be more or less costly depending on where I live, right? So at the micro level, the big thing we find is that the types of experiences you have, as well as your ideology, are contributing to whether people report to attending anti-base protests. And at the macro level, mostly what we wanted to show here was, does having more troops in your country lead to more protests? Do they actually cause more protests, right? So to kind of show that it's not just the American imperialism is here, but that it is actually the size, the potential for all these other bad things to happen. So I'll start with the micro level. And again, I'm just going to kind of zoom through this. There's a lot I'd like to say, but at the micro level, right? So what makes an individual more likely to protest? So we used our same survey data. And what we did is we first of all ran the same types of models that we did in the other chapters. And then what we did was we used about 70% of the data to then train the model and then had it predict the rest of the 30%. See, how accurate are some of these things at actually predicting whether someone will protest. With the understanding that predicting protest is actually really hard. So none of our models were that amazing, right? But we did find a few interesting things. So what do we see? Some of the things are, as expected, right? Women are more likely to protest than men. Young people in generally more likely to protest than older people. But the really interesting thing that I thought we found. So this is where we have our ROC curve, the receiver operating characteristics, because I always forget the name, so I wrote it on my hand. So let me tell you a little bit about what the ROC curve is doing. It's basically telling us how good is our model at predicting whether someone will protest, right? So in theory, right, we could predict everyone who protests by just having our model say everyone protests, right? Then we would get 100% of the protesters. The problem is it would also give us a bunch of false positives, right? Because we'd be coding the non-protesters. So what this curve is telling us, right, is it's telling us our model, what is the trade-off between giving us more of those true positives, coding the people who protested as protesting, but how many then false positives are we getting, right? Which would mean our model isn't all that great. So basically, the more the curves shift towards that upper left-hand corner, the better model we've got, right? And so you see there, we're moving from a base model that is including only the country characteristics to then one where we add demographics and attitudes, and then we add experiences, right? And so what I found really interesting is that experiences actually add a lot to people's willingness and probability of protesting. Why do I think that's interesting? Because experiences are the things that the US government and base commanders can actually control, right? You can't control how many women or men are in the population. You can't control whether they're the victim of a crime or whether they get an economic benefit. So we thought that was really interesting. This I won't spend too much time on. We did find that having more US troops essentially causes more protests. We thought that was interesting, both specifically anti-US military protests and general anti-US protests. So we gathered data. We have events data on anti-US protests, anti-US military protests, and just protests in general. Because there is a possibility that a country is just more protest prone, right? And we heard about all these cases where there might be a protest going on about something else, right? About unions. And then the US military does something that draws their attention, it turns into an anti-US protest. But basically, US troops do seem to actually lead to protests, not just the presence, but the size of your deployment. Most informative variables predicting protests are experiential, which tells us policy matters, right? You can actually make a difference. Finally, we looked at what are the experiences of minority groups in these countries. And for that, I think the field work that we did was very informative, right? In telling us type of outreach that the US military engages in towards some groups versus others, right? So basically, what we argue is that there's basically two pathways through which ethnic, religious, or racial minorities, we ask people to self-identify, can have a different experience. One is that oftentimes, I'm sure most of you know this, because this is true even in the United States, the US military's installations are oftentimes placed in areas where minorities are a majority, right? So Okinawa, I think, is probably the best known case, right? Where you have an ethnic minority, the Okinawans, and they have about, I think it's something like 70% of US military bases are in Okinawa, right? Greenland is another example, right? The way the Inuit people were harmed by the US military presence and their environment was harmed, whereas Denmark was getting all the security benefits, right? Again, within the US, we see this as well in Hawaii, right? Recent case of the water being poisoned, basically, by the US military in Hawaii. But basically, that's one case, right? The US military more present in these areas where the minorities are a majority. They're in many cases less politically influential, so they get harmed while everyone else gets the broader security benefit. The second avenue, exemplified by that somewhat troubling quote from Germany, right, is that in many cases where the US military isn't in a minority-majority population, they will do a lot of outreach. All the things I was talking about, vaccinations, going to schools, doing things like giving the local mayors passes to get onto the base, festivals, all the things. But what we came to see was that every time we asked about immigrants, refugees, or ethnic minorities in the community, we got answers that were similar to this. They're just not our priority. They have no political power, right? I was surprised they were as willing to tell us this, but they have no political power. We're not reaching out to them, right? And so we think that both of those dynamics, whichever one you might be under, would lead you to have more negative perceptions of the US military if you're a member of a self-identified minority. Also, our expectation was that those interactions that you do have with the US military will be more likely to be negative. So what did we find? So first of all, no support for hypothesis one at first. It looked like minorities were actually more likely to evaluate US actors positively, but that's the aggregate, right? What we actually see is that each country, right, once we allow the coefficients to vary by country, varies a lot, right? There's a lot of variation. In fact, if we look at the relationship between contact and minority, it isn't as we expected. It looks more like everyone else, right? Being a minority interacted with contact actually seems to be more positive. But again, look at the huge tails on this thing. Lots of variation, right? And so what we're thinking is that this relationship between minority and contact and perceptions of the US military is varying a lot across countries. So I think we identified one dynamic, the minority, majority, and the less outreach, more negative externalities, more positive, less positive externalities. That's just one distinction, right? But there's a lot going on there in terms of what ethnic minorities or religious or racial minorities are experiencing, right? Some of it is more negative externalities and less positive ones, but there's lots of complexities going on there. So future research really needs to look at that. So moving forward, we finally got to moving forward. So looking at the clock. So first of all, what do we want to do in the future? First of all, the high profile events. So we didn't really look at the effect of those, but we know that they have an effect. So we're looking at people who have experiences with the US military. What about the people who don't and all they know about the US military is what they read in the news, which was this terrible rape case or, environmental degradation, things like that. We really want to look at how high profile events affect people, both people who have had more direct contact and ones who have not. We also really want to do a comparative study, right? So at this point, we don't know if the effects we find have to do with a military presence in your country, a foreign military presence in your country, or the Americans in your country, right? And so we really want to be able to get at that. You can only do that by having a comparative study. China has been very active in the last few years. They have their first permanent foreign military installation in Djibouti. We really want to do some surveys and field work there. We're looking for funding. So far, we haven't gotten it, but I remain optimistic. And China is also looking at several other sites, right? We know that they're eyeing the Solomons. I'd really like to get out to the Solomons, Equatorial Guinea, Kenya, they've been looking at as well. So there's a lot of room, I think, to have some type of comparative study. And someone like a country like China, right, that is actually looking to have a bigger presence, how are they going to handle some of these issues that the US has been dealing with for 70 years, right? What's their approach going to be like? Finally, the role of diversity in the US military, right? So we looked at minorities in the host country, but what about the changing face of the US military, right? So we talked to a journalist in Peru, this young journalist, again, a country without a big military presence, and he said, well, when we think of the American military, we think of muscular men waving the flag around and yelling about democracy, right? But when we were doing field work, we actually saw very different kinds of service members, right? So in England, one of the service members, she was lesbian, and she said she and her wife oftentimes participated in pride rallies in Lakenheath. A lot of the service members now are second or third generation immigrants, right? They might speak the same languages as the people in some of these countries they're deployed to, right? One service member we talked to, for example, was she said she identified as half Filipina, right? And she said, I look different than some people, but there's plenty of other people like me in the service, right? So some of them, again, they might speak the languages, they might look like the people of the countries where they're deploying to, or just very simply look different from the stereotype. LGBTQ presence, of course, is growing in the US military. More women. We have this kind of funny quote from a former ambassador to Panama. Please send me Mormons, and send me women. Right? He's talking about the US military, and he was saying they don't cause trouble. They don't go out and cause trouble. He was, kind of joking around with us. But, for example, crime, right? We know from criminology that women probabilistically are less likely to commit a lot of crimes, right? What happens when the US military suddenly has more women? All of these things. So there's a lot of room to explore that in the future. And I'll stop now and we can do some Q&A.